Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei-Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Chaminade University.
Oh, aloha. Happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us here on Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Yanji Denise, joined by Ryan Kalei-Suji. And Ryan, today we are taking the view from Washington.
That's right. Joining us this morning is Senator Brian Schatz. Good morning, Senator. Thanks so much for joining us here this morning.
Good morning. Good to be back in Honolulu.
Great to see you. Let's start off a lot of topics that we want to talk about, but we want to begin with President Biden's infrastructure package that was recently passed. What can you tell us specifically about this bill and the impacts that it will have overall for residents here in Hawaii?
Well, this is really great news. You know, we've been talking about doing infrastructure since I got to the Senate 9 years ago. I've worked under 3 different presidents. Every president says, let's do infrastructure. This is the only president with whom we've been able to get it done on a bipartisan basis. So what does it mean for Hawaii? At least $2.8 billion for the state of Hawaii for roads, harbors, highways, the airports, broadband, our transit systems, our water systems, helping to mitigate against climate change. So these are, physical investments over the next 3 to 5 years, and they're designed to last for decades. This is not another COVID relief package or even a stimulus package. This is about looking around our state and seeing dilapidated infrastructure and finally doing something really significant about it. Biggest infrastructure investment on the federal side, certainly in at least 30 years.
I know that money will be handed out over the course of 5 years. What can we expect to be priority number 1? Where do you see the biggest need, and when can we actually start to feel the effects of this legislation?
Well, I think some of the money is going to get spent pretty fast because, for instance, the Department of Transportation Highways, they just have a list of projects and programs that need to get done, and they can kind of never get to the bottom of their list. And so you give them more money and they finish more projects. The same with the airports and the harbors. Some of the other stuff is going to take a little bit of time because they're new programs, especially climate change mitigation. There's not an existing department for that. And so you should expect them to take a year or so to kind of configure the program and spend the money right. And for me, the philosophy is a little different for this money than the previous CARES Acts and the American Rescue Plan, where the idea was this is an absolute emergency. Businesses are folding, people are in danger of losing their homes. Push the money out as fast as you can. We certainly want the governments, the county and state government, to do stuff quick, but we also need them to do stuff responsibly. And since it's construction, the planning and design process really matters, and we want to give them enough space to not just throw it all out there in the next 6 months.
One of the debated issues with this bill overall was that the term infrastructure was used in many different ways, not just solely for transportation issues, but the infrastructure of broadband and a number of different means that has been folded into this overall package beyond just roadways and transportation. What other elements and things are included in this bill that will benefit Hawaii in other areas?
Well, we've never really had a big infrastructure investment on the broadband side from the federal government. There's this thing called the Universal Service Fund, which funds hard to connect neighborhoods. But that was mired in scandal in the state of Hawaii. And so we had great difficulty with that. The money wasn't spent properly, but also it was difficult to get additional money after the scandal. In this bill, there's $160 million for broadband infrastructure and $60 million specifically for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands to connect Native Hawaiians to the internet. And I think what the pandemic has demonstrated to us in real life, like everybody said this all along, but during the pandemic, you realize whether it's work or connecting with family or healthcare or even finding a new job, The internet is an absolute essential. It is not a nice to have. It is not for entertainment purposes, although it can be used for that. And there are still tens of thousands of people across the state of Hawaii with no broadband connectivity, and this money will help to solve that problem.
I want to ask you about where rail comes into play here. We know that there was a federal extension that you were able to secure more rail funding for Hawaii. Can you tell us about what specifically was done so that we can have access to those federal funds?
Well, sure. There was about $500 million that was going to lapse, expire, and be gone by the end of this calendar year. I was able to insert a provision in the infrastructure package, which is now law, to extend us through 2023. That doesn't mean more money. It does mean we saved the $500 million that was in jeopardy for another 2.5 years. And I'm hesitant to express optimism about rail because our experience has taught us that optimism is not usually borne out. However, I do think we're getting closer and closer to finishing this thing. I think the funding gap that's now been announced seems to be at least in the range of what is manageable from the transient accommodations tax. Now they got to sharpen their pencils and figure out exactly what the funding shortfall is and exactly how much is generated via TAT. But they're in that process, and I can kind of see the end. I do think we can get to Ala Moana Center. And I think we really should get to Ala Moana Center because whatever anyone's frustrations are with the way this has happened, whether you started out pro-rail and ended up anti or the other way around, we've just got to finish this thing. We can't have, it's like building 90% of a fence, but then there's pukas in it. It just doesn't work unless you finish it, and we just have to finish it.
There's been some debate over whether or not the rail should start sooner rather than later with regards to starting from Kapolese to Aloha Stadium with the segments that are done and being able to at least have that portion of the rail continue on while the rest of the rail is being constructed as it enters the town quarter. What are your thoughts on just having this project begin and having at least partial of the rail running as the first sort of section is complete and operational?
Well, notionally, I don't have any difficulty with that. I guess I would say that's a question of arithmetic. Do you end up starting your operating expenses and not have the fare box revenue to carry the day? And so my, singular concern is let's get this TAT across the finish line. Let's get better specificity on exactly what the shortfall is. And let's see if we can finish construction. I don't have a strong objection to the thing being operational a little sooner, but I just do think, Hart is not that big of a shop. And I think all hands should be on deck in terms of city center and then to Ala Moana Center, work with the county, the council and the mayor are working nicely together and get this thing done. It'd be cool if it were operational, a couple of years earlier, but that for me is not the highest priority.
Okay. I want to ask you about Build Back Better. Of course, getting the infrastructure package across the finish line was a tremendous victory for this White House. The next project, of course, is BBB, as we hear it so often called. Where do you think this bill stands right now? And in its current iteration, what could Hawaii benefit from?
Well, we're in pretty good shape. I mean, I think anyone who follows politics super closely understands it passed the U.S. House of Representatives. And now it's come to the Senate, and we need to get 50 votes. And we probably have 49 right now. And so we're going to have a negotiation to figure out how to land on 50. I'm reasonably confident that we're going to land on 50, and I'm reasonably confident. So that's process. So let's set aside process. Now let's talk about what's in the bill, because what's in the bill is super exciting to me. My favorite aspects of the bill are, first of all, we will reduce the cost of prescription medicine for people on Medicare massively. People are paying several $100s, sometimes $600 a month for insulin. That amount will be capped at $35 a month for any American who needs insulin. So millions of Americans are going to be able to finally afford their insulin. It's embarrassing that we live in a country where insulin is cheap everywhere across the planet except here, but we're finally going to fix that. We also are going to cap the total amount that anybody will pay for their prescription medicine, either as a copay or direct pay in a year, down to $2,000 from about $5,000. So that'll save many, many seniors, including my father-in-law, about $3,000 a year. So on the prescription medicine piece, it's not everything that I wanted, but it's the first time really ever that we've gone in and reduced the cost of prescription medicine and had it come out of the profits of the pharmaceutical companies. So I'm happy about that. Second, universal pre-K. And I think because we've been so busy arguing with ourselves that the drama was about the drama. The drama was about the process and what's Joe Manchin going to do and what are the House moderates going to do and all of that. But nobody's talking about, my goodness, imagine how different someone's life will be with free universal pre-K. And so I'm really, really excited if we can deliver that. And then finally, the biggest climate bill in American history, getting us probably 80% of our way towards our clean energy goals. And I know from Hawaii how many times we had to update our clean energy laws and how many times I would take 30% of our way to a goal. So if we can spend about $500 billion in mostly clean energy tax incentives to really jumpstart this clean energy revolution, I think that is, those three things right there are 2 Congresses worth of progress all in one bill. And there's probably 10 other things in this bill that I'm excited about, but I'm trying to display a little of what they call message discipline and just talking about a few of them.
Many of the critics of this bill say that it is just too expensive and it's putting a burden on future generations. And that has caused some of the negotiations to be prolonged, as well as some of the arguments from the other side of the aisle and some within the Democratic Party themselves. What are your thoughts on those who criticize the overall costs of what this whole bill entails?
Yeah, I guess I would just point out that all of the CARES Act bills were not paid for. The Department of Defense annual bill is around $800 billion and is not paid for. The infrastructure package, which we just enacted, was only about 2/3 paid for. This bill, Build Back Better, at the insistence of the president, is totally paid for and probably then some. We're probably actually generating more revenue than we are spending, and not a single penny for anybody who makes less than $400,000 a year as a single filer. Nobody's going to see a tax increase if you make less than $400,000 a year. So I think it's pretty smart. There were 17 Nobel Prize winning economists who came together to say, not only will this bill not make inflation worse, but it'll actually alleviate some inflationary pressures. So I'm very comfortable with this bill as a long-term spending bill, because we generate the revenue mostly from increased taxes on the wealthiest individuals and the wealthiest corporations. And we spend it on things that actually help the economy, like universal pre-K and helping people with their childcare.
I want to ask you, you referenced climate change and all the benefits that this bill could bring on that issue. I know that you went to Glasgow and attended the UN Climate Conference. Tell us about that experience and where Hawaii sort of plays in that conversation.
Well, it was great. I've gone to most of these climate conferences, and sometimes it was a little rough to show up with Donald Trump as president. And Mike Pompeo as the Secretary of State not just not participating, but aggressively trying to undermine international efforts on the climate side. And so people were really happy to see us. People were really happy to see the change. I think part of the difficulty that we have now is a bit of a deficit of trust with other nations who rightly say, hey, I know you're back. I think that's great. But how do we know that American leadership isn't going to exit the stage in 2 years, should the election go the other way? And so we had a lot of those conversations. But in the big picture, they made incredibly important announcements, trillions of dollars for climate finance, and also an international pledge to cut deforestation in half by 50%. So that's all the positive. The negative is these are just announcements. We have to make laws to actually make them happen. And especially on the climate finance side, it's pretty easy to move numbers around and make it look like you're doing a ton on the climate finance side and still invest in fossil fuel infrastructure. And so I think the job for all of us collectively, certainly people in the Congress, is to put teeth behind those announcements, put reality behind those announcements, be sort of cold-blooded, if you will, be clear-eyed about how realistic these announcements are. Because, we had this incredible Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, which really was voluntary and aspirational. And the only reason we've been able to execute is because lots of people worked really hard on permitting and siting and financing and the technology and the community work and the tax credits. And so now it's time for us to kind of do the do on climate. Talking is great, but now it's time to execute.
And that is was going to be my follow-up question: is how do you do that? Essentially, the United States can do its part to really, as you say, have teeth to the agreements that were made and see that our country could kind of execute some of the things that has been promised. But when you're dealing with other nations, often some people say that it's great to talk about, but the reality is not much will change. Do you feel leaving this conference that some things will change and that there will be a commitment to making some of these goals a reality?
Oh, yeah, I do feel like, look, it's hard to get other countries to do things. It's always been hard. But the United States has always been what Secretary Madeleine Albright used to call us the indispensable nation, right? So we can't solve every problem, but we're pretty indispensable to anything that is a global problem. And if there's one thing that's a global problem, it's climate change. So the Chinese were pretty negative coming into this meeting, and John Kerry did a lot he's the special envoy for climate change now. He did a lot of quiet diplomacy with an old colleague and friend of his in the Chinese government, and they came out and made some really encouraging announcements. They were going to stop the financing of overseas coal, and they may, in fact, stop the building of new coal-fired power plants. So there was real progress made on the international side, and the only way we can make progress on the international side is if we have the credibility to say we're doing it ourselves, and that's why we have to pass Build Back Better.
There's some questions in here about financial help for homeowners. I just wonder broadly, because we've been talking to you throughout the pandemic about what you're hearing from your constituents. Especially now that you're in district, I'd imagine that anywhere you go to the grocery store, you probably get an earful. What are the concerns that are being brought to your office right now?
So it has changed. And I would say over the last 2 or 3 months, it's really changed. As the COVID numbers go down, people are asking for more day-to-day regular government services, determining their eligibility for VA benefits or something with the Social Security Office or the Passport Office or U.S. Postal Service or whatever it may be, or DOD. And because, people were working from home, there are now just regular backlogs, not COVID constituent requests, but just regular constituent requests that are backed up because people have been working from home. And so most federal agencies, and my guess is most state agencies, are now just trying to plow through their regular backlog. So as I look through the numbers and I try to look at them every week or so, it's less specifically like, how do I access this COVID relief grant? Because I think most people have either figured it out or not by now. And we worked really hard to put together fact sheets and help people and walk them through all of that. Now the stuff is more just VA's not getting back to us about my service-connected eligibility determination and stuff like that. And so we want to make sure that as people come back to work, that we plow through all those backlogs and people get the service that they paid for.
I want to ask you another topic that has made some headlines and no doubt will continue to spur on much debate is the evolution of cryptocurrency and its impact on the U.S. economy. What is your take overall on crypto, specifically the U.S. government's role in this digital currency as it grows throughout the country and worldwide?
Well, I think digital currency can be really exciting. And I think what they call frictionless payments is great for consumers. The idea that you still have to, in order to pay a taxi driver or swipe your card at the 7-Eleven, that you're paying Visa, some percentage of your money every time for a transaction. And there's no particular reason that it should continue that way. So a frictionless payment system would be a way where essentially Apple Pay or Venmo, same thing. When you move money to a friend to pay them back for lunch or whatever it is, Visa doesn't take a cut. And so that's, to me, what's really exciting and kind of democratizing about this. If I'm going to express some reservations, I worry about especially hostile foreign actors and criminal syndicates being able to hide a little bit better using blockchain technology and using cryptocurrency. I don't think that means that we stop the whole thing, but I do think the U.S. banking system and U.S. regulators and U.S. law enforcement has to be able to get eyeballs on money moved, because otherwise some very bad people are going to be able to move money with incredible swiftness and without us knowing at all that it's happening. So those are sort of two sides of the coin as I continue to learn about this.
I want to ask you just about being home. The governor yesterday announced some changes to some of the restrictions with his executive order, but by and large, we're still living under a lot of restrictions compared to other states. What do you think about the governor in his leadership on the pandemic, specifically when it comes to things like indoor mask mandates and restrictions like that?
Well, look, I think I'm glad that these restrictions are being lifted. So let's just talk directionally. A lot of people have been obeying the rules for a very long time. A lot of people are, double vaxxed and trying to figure out whether to get the booster right before Thanksgiving or right after. And so a lot of people are doing the right thing. And the COVID rates, as I knock on wood, are relatively low and manageable. The hospitalizations, I think yesterday were 36. And I don't think we're going to get rid of COVID. I think the idea is to manage this as an endemic disease. And with the new pharmaceutical possibility of, you can be boosted, and then even if you did come down with COVID, you could theoretically take a course of these pills that could reduce hospitalizations by another 80%. I imagine we can get back to normal relatively quickly. And I think that should be the direction. I don't necessarily feel like everything needs to be lifted all at once, because I do think there are mixed views in society, even in individual families, about how much comfort they have. But we've got to move in the direction of normal and find normalcy in the idea that COVID is not going to be at zero, and that can no longer be the objective. The idea is to minimize preventable deaths, but look, there are 750 or so under normal circumstances people who die in the state of Hawaii from flu. And that is a terrible tragedy. And when I was lieutenant governor, I worked really hard on vaccinations along those lines. But it never occurred to anybody to shut down the whole of society to bring that number of flu deaths down to zero. And I think just psychologically and in terms of our policy, we have to start thinking of this in terms of keeping the death rate as low as humanly possible, but also allowing the rest of us to move on with our lives in a safe way. And I think the science permits us to do both things now.
As someone who travels often between Hawaii and Washington, D.C. and really abroad, one of the things that you have to do when coming back into the state is filling out that Safe Travels program form and making sure that all of that is uploaded. The state announcing yesterday that it will continue on with the Safe Travels program. Do you agree that this is a program that should continue on for some time as we continue to move through this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking really good questions, and I'm usually very cautious to sort of substitute my judgment for a governor or a mayor. But let me just give you my view on Safe Travels. It's running pretty well. Understandably had some hiccups at the beginning because this was a brand new program. But I got to say, the airport, the Department of Health, National Guard, the counties, everybody really worked hard, and the employees at the airport in particular work really hard. And this thing is not that inconvenient anymore. And so I'm inclined to leave it in place because I don't think it's a massive inconvenience. I think it does give comfort to the people who are understandably grouchy about tourists coming and congregating. And the idea that they're either vaccinated or tested, I think is, some reassurance. And it just doesn't seem to be diminishing the extent to which we're, rebounding on the tourism side. And so if I were the governor, I would not have gotten rid of it yesterday. I do, I'm glad that we can now, have a beer at a UH basketball game and some of those things. And I think some of those things are kind of underestimated by politicians in terms of how much they kind of just get under a regular person's skin, where you feel like you're doing all the right stuff and you triple vaccinated and you're wearing a mask and you just want to sip on a beer, and it seems pretty fair. And so I think the more we can do in loosening up those restrictions, the more I think people are going to be less grouchy generally about this situation.
Well, on that, and I do know that these are very local issues and not necessarily the purview of a senator, but what about the safe access Oahu, protocols for having to have vaccine verification to enter establishments? Do you think that is still appropriate given the high level of vaccinations that we have and the low case count?
I do, because I think, first of all, I think we learned from the Delta that we want to be very careful about sort of declaring victory too early. So I don't necessarily think we should hurry to change those kinds of restrictions. But I also just think that lots of diners really like the idea that they're in a place where they're among those who are either vaccinated or tested. And so it's difficult because you're dealing with, people have rights on both sides of that equation. And I don't think there's any necessarily crisp right answer to that. But I think certainly in the next month or so, and the holidays coming up, and lots of restaurants now reducing their, space between tables, I'm still comfortable with leaving those requirements in place.
I want to ask you before we end here, as we look at the politics that is happening in Washington, D.C., there just seems to be a lot of polarizing figures out there, many of which have pitted Democrats versus Republicans. And it seems often that only things that we see from the national media standpoint is this constant fighting between both Democrats and Republicans on a variety of issues. I'm wondering if there is any bipartisanship that is happening out there that often doesn't get reported, maybe things that you've worked on that might illustrate some sense of unity that's happening there in Washington, D.C.
Oh, sure. And that's a really good question, because I get it a lot. It's like, are you always, wanting to kill each other kind of thing? And the answer is no. Look, I do think it's worse than it's been in a long time. But I still remember in Teddy Kennedy's book, he used to say, you roar on the floor, right? And he would give these really, sharp partisan speeches where people would get really, really angry. And then, because it was the old days, we don't do this anymore, actually, but then because it was the old days, they would pour a scotch and cut a deal, right? And that's kind of how we imagine the old Senate to work, where, yeah, you fight about certain things, but you find common ground. That still exists. I'm working on the Restore Honor to Service Members Act, which is to reverse the dishonorable discharges of LGBTQ service members over many, many years, who were discharged from the military dishonorably for what they said on their discharge form was homosexual behavior. That's what they got discharged for. And they don't get VA benefits. They don't get even burial benefits or spousal visitation benefits. And so I'm working with Joni Ernst and Ben Sass, two of the more conservative members of the whole U.S. Senate, on this legislation. We're about to pass the defense bill with a big bipartisan vote. I've been able to work, especially in the criminal justice space, with some surprising partners with whom I disagree so severely on other stuff that I have to, kind of be careful to compartmentalize my disagreements. But we've been able to get, Pell Grants restored for prisoners, the Emergency Grace Act, so marijuana for veterans. There's a bunch of areas where we're really doing good bipartisan work, but frankly, that's not interesting to the cable shows. And so it's hard to get the word out. And even when I put it out on social media that I'm doing bipartisan work, it's the least clickbaity stuff I have. I get 14 likes. And if I just say something nasty about the other side, I'll get 500 likes. And so thank you for asking that question. It's a really important aspect of my job.
Well, before we let you go, it is almost the top of the hour, but tomorrow is Thanksgiving. Are you hosting? Are you cooking? What are your family plans?
We are hosting, and so we rotate hosts among the brothers. It's our turn to host, and I'm mostly in charge of cleaning and chairs and tables and lights and stuff, and we'll be and booze, and we'll be kept out of the kitchen for the most part.
Sounds like my role as well. But thank you so much, Senator, for taking time to update us. There's often a lot of things that are happening from Washington, D.C., and oftentimes us here in Hawaii, it seems so far away and untangible, but it's great to hear the updates, and thank you for being a part of this conversation on this Thanksgiving Eve.
Thank you both, and happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Aloha.
Thanksgiving. Well, great to hear from him, and good to drill down into the details, especially on the infrastructure package, looking at, Hawaii in line to get $2.8 billion over the course of 5 years. He talked about, unlike the CARES Act money or the ARPA funds, not trying to spend that in a rush, but really being diligent about where that money goes. There is so much need in our community. I'm sure all of us could name a road, a bridge, an area that we know that needs work. And so this money is definitely needed and going to be well spent. He also talked about Build Back Better and what he hopes that will bring to Hawaii. There are a lot of things in that bill, as we know, but he really honed in specifically on childcare, that is going to be something major, and also cutting medical expenses specifically for seniors.
Yeah, and a bill that continues to be debated over not only within members of the Democratic and Republican Party, but also between the majority party themselves, and some disagreements on how that bill will move forward. You heard a sense of optimism that he does feel that they will get to the number that they need to pass this through. And he's saying that there are some key pieces of legislation in there that will really help to accomplish things that would take Congress 2 terms to get done. Him saying that they will be able to essentially get this done just with this one bill alone. But much debate still to remain over what actually gets included in this bill. And we will continue to track that progress as it moves through the Senate.
Yeah, and specifically, he also talked about the impact it could have on climate change and helping to, boost the renewable energy market, not just here in Hawaii, but really across the country, and how important that is to reaching the goals. He sounded very optimistic also coming out of COP26 and the gains there. So that was good to hear. And you heard for the most part that he agrees with the restrictions, the cautious approach that the governor and that the mayor have taken when it comes to COVID mitigation, but also saying that at some point we need to get used to living with this virus and laying out how we do that.
And someone that is working, of course, very closely on all of that and with the governor is Director of Health, Libby Char. She will be joining us on Friday to continue on in this conversation about what's happening here in the state of Hawaii when it comes to COVID-19, what the state is doing to help prepare for those booster shots, how things are going with vaccinations among children, as well as what she's expecting after all these holiday gatherings. A lot to discuss with Dr. Char. That's happening on Friday. But until then, we wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you right back here on Friday at 10:30 for another edition of Spotlight Hawaii. Aloha.
Happy Thanksgiving.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii was brought to you by Chaminade University.